What's up, everyone? Tony from the Cold Case Project, back again. And today, what I want to run with you over is all content shared in these videos is readily available in any Google search. Now, with that said, I take this content, have it rewritten, and upon rewriting it, put it in these videos to spread the word on the thousands and thousands of cold cases of men and women throughout the United States that are just forgotten, and I give this platform to them so their cases and their stories can be told. Now, in addition to that, if you look down below in the description, you're going to see some brand new t-shirt and coffee cup designs I've actually gotten from a couple of my subscribers who have over the years have been giving me some awesome fan art. So with that said, I'm offering a 20% discount code down below if you check that out, and splitting proceeds with them because they are awesome. Been watching me for quite some time, and I definitely think they deserve to be rewarded for some of the work they do on top of being full-time employees also. So once again, if you have any recommendations or any suggestions, comment down below. Thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the video. Like, subscribe. I'm out. Peace.
In the early morning hours of November 19th, 2016, a life was extinguished that had already endured more heartbreak than most could fathom. Tommy Ballard, a 54-year-old husband, father, grandfather, and the relentless seeker of truth in his daughter's disappearance, was shot and killed while on a family hunting trip in Nelson County, Kentucky. The man who had vowed to spend his last dime and his last breath searching for Crystal Rogers, a mother of 5 who vanished without a trace the previous summer, was gone. And almost immediately, a grieving family, a devastated community, and a skeptical public were left asking, was this really a hunting accident, or had Tommy gotten too close to the truth? Tommy Ballard's name had become synonymous with justice in the year following Crystal Rogers' disappearance in July 2015. Crystal was last seen on the farm property of her boyfriend Brooks Houck, the man later named the main suspect in her disappearance. Tommy never believed Brooks, or anyone connected to him, had told the full story, and he never stopped trying to uncover what really happened to his daughter. By day, Tommy worked as a construction foreman, and by night he became an investigator, a search organizer, a local media contact, and a voice for the missing. He and his wife, Sherry Ballard, printed flyers, coordinated searches, and held prayer vigils. They placed hundreds of signs throughout Bardstown, pleading for information. Tommy combed through records, documented suspicious activity, and openly called for accountability from local law enforcement. It was more than grief that motivated him. It was a sense of responsibility. A man driven by principle, Tommy had made it clear to friends and family, "I'll never stop until I find her." But someone may have wanted him to stop. It was just after 8 a.m. on Saturday, November 19th, 2016. Tommy Ballard had gone hunting on family-owned property off Ed Brent Lane, just off the Bluegrass Parkway, with his 11-year-old grandson. This was a routine outing for Tommy, a seasoned hunter. According to family, he was approximately 75 to 100 feet from his parked truck when a fatal shot was fired. It struck him in the back. What followed was chaos and heartbreak. His young grandson, who had just moments before been joking and walking beside him, was now frantically calling for help. Family members rushed to the scene. When Sherry arrived, she saw what no wife should ever have to see: her husband lying lifeless in a field, surrounded by emergency responders and yellow crime scene tape. The Kentucky State Police, the Nelson County Sheriff's Office, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife all converged on the site. A full investigation was launched, but officials were careful not to draw conclusions too early. "We're treating this as a death investigation," KSB spokesman Trooper Jeff Gregory told reporters that day. "To rule it as anything else right now would be irresponsible." To Tommy's family, however, the theory of a hunting accident never made sense. For one, Tommy was known to wear blaze orange, standard hunter's gear, to prevent precisely this sort of tragedy. He was cautious, experienced, and familiar with the property. No one else had permission to hunt the area. And, critically, no one else was reported to be there. In the weeks before his death, Tommy had voiced growing concerns. Sherry later revealed that Tommy had confided in her multiple times. He believed he was being followed. Strange vehicles had been parked near their home. He had even made comments about needing to change up his daily routine, concerned that someone might be watching. Those suspicions weren't paranoia, they were rooted in context. Tommy had spent over a year pushing hard against a wall of silence. He'd spoken out publicly against the Houck family, most notably Brooks Houck, the last person known to see Crystal alive, and Brooks' brother Nick Houck, a former Bardstown police officer fired for interfering in the investigation. Tommy believed the community was harboring dark secrets, and some had already begun warning him to be careful. He told me more than once, Sherry recalled, "If anything ever happens to me, you keep fighting." By the time of Tommy's death, the Crystal Rogers investigation had reached a boiling point. The FBI had become involved. A search warrant had been executed on property owned by the Houck family. Investigators were increasingly interested in a white Buick once owned by Anna Whitesides, Brooks Houck's grandmother, which was suspected to have been used to dispose of a body. Whitesides, who sold the vehicle shortly after Crystal disappeared, invoked her Fifth Amendment right when subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury. And Nick Houck, the ex-cop who'd allegedly warned his brother not to speak to police, was also under scrutiny. Phone records, GPS data, and search logs tied Nick to suspicious activity the night Crystal vanished. Though no charges had been filed, the walls were closing in. Tommy Ballard's mission had begun rattling the right cages. It's no wonder his family believed his death was no accident. "I don't feel like my husband's death was an accident," Sherry Ballard said shortly after the funeral. "I'll never think it was. I think someone wanted my husband out of the way because we were getting close to Crystal." Despite mounting public suspicion, investigators have never ruled Tommy Ballard's death a homicide. The Kentucky State Police have remained tight-lipped. The case remains classified as a death investigation, not a murder. Officials have not publicly identified any persons of interest, nor have they offered a timeline for resolution. This silence has only deepened the family's mistrust of law enforcement, particularly in Nelson County. The same community that had seen multiple unsolved murders, including the 2013 ambush killing of Bardstown police officer Jason Ellis, was now being asked to accept that Tommy Ballard's death was just a tragic coincidence. For the Ballards, that wasn't good enough. In the months after Tommy's death, his absence left a hole that could never be filled. But his work continued. Friends and neighbors came together to finish the float Tommy had been building for the Bardstown Christmas Parade, a tribute to Crystal. It featured white angel wings, pink tulle, and a candle for every missing person. When the float rolled down the street that December, Sherry and her grandchildren stood in tears. Tommy's dream had become reality, even if he wasn't there to see it. His death became a second mission. Now they were seeking justice for both a missing daughter and a murdered father. Tommy's words lived on through his wife. "We will never stop. Not until we know what happened to Crystal. Not until the people responsible for taking Tommy from us are held accountable." As of 2025, no one has been charged in the death of Tommy Ballard. Crystal Rogers is still missing, but the case has not been forgotten. In 2020, the FBI announced it was taking over the Crystal Rogers case and began serving new search warrants. Federal agents returned to Bardstown in 2021 and 2023, conducting renewed digs on Houck family property and uncovering previously undisclosed evidence. Still, the public has been given few answers. In 2022, Brooks Houck was arrested and charged with murder in Crystal's case, nearly 7 years after her disappearance. The arrest breathed new life into Tommy's legacy. The man he had always believed was responsible was finally being held accountable. But the investigation into Tommy Ballard's death remains unresolved. The tragic story of Tommy Ballard is one of devotion and determination. He wasn't a cop, a lawyer, or an investigator. He was a father who refused to let his daughter's name fade from memory. He fought with heart, with honor, and with everything he had. And then, on a cold Kentucky morning, someone silenced him. Was a hunter's mistake? A tragic accident? Or was it the final act in a long, calculated effort to bury the truth? A man whose own death may be the most chilling clue of all. In late November of 1976, 31-year-old Georgia Nolan vanished under mysterious circumstances while en route to Chicago, Illinois, with her estranged husband. She was last seen in Harlan, Kentucky, and despite extensive efforts to uncover the truth, Georgia Nolan has never been heard from again. The various accounts provided by her husband and the lack of concrete evidence have led authorities to suspect foul play in her case, though her whereabouts remain a mystery to this day. Georgia Nolan's story is one marked by a troubled marriage, complicated family dynamics, and conflicting testimonies from the person who was with her when she disappeared. For years, her case remained unsolved. The details surrounding her disappearance are as confusing and troubling as the circumstances of her life leading up to it. Before her disappearance, Georgia Nolan had already been through a tumultuous period in her personal life. She had married her husband in her 20s, but their relationship was fraught with difficulty. The couple had 4 children, and Georgia had recently separated from her husband. Just before the birth of their youngest child, Georgia left their home in Chicago and returned to her family in Kentucky, where she grew up. The separation was difficult, and it seemed as if the marriage might end permanently. However, in the months following the birth of their youngest child, Georgia's husband came to Kentucky with hopes of reconciling. After some time apart, the couple decided to try and rebuild their relationship. They made plans to return to Chicago together, bringing their 2-month-old baby with them. The couple's decision to reconcile seemed like an attempt at mending their broken relationship, but what happened next would forever shroud their reunion in mystery. They dropped off their youngest child at the husband's mother's house before setting off on the journey back to Chicago, but Georgia would never make it there. According to her estranged husband, they left Kentucky and began their drive to Chicago. The details of what happened during the trip are unclear, as her husband gave conflicting accounts of the events leading up to Georgia's disappearance. Initially, he claimed that they had become separated near Indianapolis, Indiana, but the story quickly evolved over time. In another version of events, he stated that they had gotten into an argument during the trip, and he had let Georgia out of the car on the interstate between Indiana and Illinois. Years later, he would tell yet another version of the story, one in which they stopped at a gas station in Indianapolis, and Georgia called a strange woman, who then came and picked her up. This shift in his testimony raised many questions. The inconsistencies in his statements made it difficult for investigators to establish a clear timeline of George's last known whereabouts. Moreover, there was no evidence to support his story of an argument or the supposed interaction with a woman at the gas station. There was no sign of Georgia at any of the places her husband claimed she had gone, and no one came forward to corroborate his version of events. Shortly after Georgia's disappearance, her husband filed papers accusing her of child abandonment and named his own mother as the next of kin. The couple's children were placed into the custody of his mother, who took care of them, while Georgia's husband continued his life in Chicago. In 1980, just a few years after Georgia went missing, he returned to Kentucky and filed for divorce. The circumstances surrounding Georgia Nolan's disappearance have led authorities to suspect foul play. Her estranged husband's conflicting accounts only deepen the mystery, and investigators believe his involvement could be key to solving the case. The fact that Georgia was never heard from again after their journey to Chicago raised red flags, as did the subsequent events and the strange legal maneuvers made by her husband. There was no contact from Georgia after her disappearance. She never returned to her family, never reached out to her children, and never attempted to use her Social Security number, which remained inactive. This lack of activity, particularly the absence of any financial transactions or personal contact, pointed to the possibility that Georgia had been harmed or was otherwise incapacitated. Her Social Security number, which would have been used for benefits or other personal affairs, remained untouched after 1976, further suggesting that something was seriously amiss. Georgia's disappearance, compounded by the inconsistencies in her husband's statements, made investigators suspicious. They questioned whether he might have played a role in her vanishing, though the evidence was insufficient to make any definitive conclusions. The mystery of what happened to Georgia Nolan deepened with the years, and with each passing year, it became less likely that new evidence would emerge to shed light on her fate. For her brother, who reported her missing on November 28, 1976, the loss of his sister has been a painful journey. The family's grief has been compounded by the lack of information about Georgia's whereabouts and the troubling circumstances of her disappearance. They have spent years hoping for answers, but the case remains cold, with no new leads or developments. With her Social Security number remaining unused and her husband's contradictory accounts of her disappearance, the case has continued to gnaw at those who remember Georgia and love her. Her children grew up without the comfort of knowing what happened to their mother, and her family members have spent decades searching for answers that may never come. There are a few prevailing theories regarding what happened to Georgia Nolan. Given the troubled nature of her marriage and her husband's conflicting statements, some believe that Georgia may have been killed during or after an argument. The fact that she was traveling with her husband and then vanished without a trace raises the possibility that he was involved in her disappearance, though there is not enough evidence to confirm this. Another theory is that Georgia may have voluntarily left her family, though this theory seems unlikely given the circumstances. It is hard to imagine that a woman who had recently reconciled with her husband and had just given birth to their youngest child would decide to abandon her family. The lack of any contact from Georgia since her disappearance cast doubt on this theory. Some have speculated that Georgia might have been the victim of a random crime while traveling, or that she could have been taken by someone else. However, no substantial evidence has ever emerged to support this theory. The case of Georgia Nolan remains unsolved. The conflicting accounts given by her estranged husband, the lack of evidence supporting any of his stories, and the fact that Georgia's Social Security number has never been used since 1976 all suggest that foul play is likely involved. On the afternoon of November 19, 1992, in Danville, Kentucky, 25-year-old Anna Manning was last seen outside Chin's Jewelry on North 3rd Street. She called out to her aunt, saying she wanted to speak to her about something. At the time, she was accompanied by an unidentified white male, whose identity remains unknown to this day. Anna never made it to her aunt's house later that day, and she has never been heard from again, though her disappearance was not officially reported until over a year later. Authorities have always suspected foul play, considering the strange circumstances surrounding her case. As the investigation unfolded, a troubled history involving Anna's marriage and the involvement of her estranged husband, Anthony B. Manning, would come to light, casting a dark shadow over the events leading up to her vanishing. Born and raised in Danville, Kentucky, Anna Manning was only 16 years old when she married Anthony B. Manning in 1985. Her marriage to Anthony, however, was far from ideal. The young couple faced significant challenges, and their relationship quickly became strained. Anna distanced herself from her family after the marriage, leaving behind the aunt who had raised her since the age of 13. By the time of her disappearance, Anna's family had no knowledge of where she was living, and they were unaware of the full extent of the difficulties she was enduring in her marriage. In the years that followed their marriage, Anna and Anthony's relationship deteriorated further. They eventually separated in 1992, which was around the time Anna was last seen. Despite the separation, the complex and unhealthy dynamics between the two would play a pivotal role in the events surrounding her disappearance. In April of 1992, just months before Anna vanished, a disturbing incident occurred that would later be seen as a potential precursor to her disappearance. Anthony Manning was charged with kidnapping after allegedly going to Anna's apartment in Junction City, Kentucky, with their daughter in tow. According to reports, Anthony handcuffed Anna when she refused to engage in sexual intercourse with him, then tried to lead her out the back door of the apartment. Anna was able to break free when Anthony turned his attention to taking their daughter and her purse to the car. After escaping, Anna sought help, and Anthony was arrested. The charge was later reduced to unlawful imprisonment, and Anthony pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to just 182 days in jail for the incident. This event was a significant marker in the troubled history of Anna and Anthony's relationship, further suggesting the extent of abuse Anna may have faced. At the time of her disappearance, Anthony was still incarcerated, which raises the question of whether he had any involvement in her vanishing. He was released from jail just a few months later, adding another layer of suspicion to the timeline. On the day Anna disappeared, she was seen outside Chin's Jewelry, where she spoke briefly with her aunt, who had raised her since childhood. Anna told her aunt that she wanted to talk to her about something, but she was with an unidentified white male at the time. After this brief exchange, Anna was never seen again. Anna had planned to visit her aunt later that day, but she never arrived. This was not typical behavior for Anna, as she had maintained regular contact with her family, especially with her aunt, with whom she had a close bond. The fact that she suddenly disappeared without any explanation or follow-up communication was out of character and immediately raised alarms. Anna had a 2-year-old daughter at the time, and her disappearance left the child without a mother. Despite the grave concern of Anna's family, it wasn't until February 25, 1994, more than a year after Anna was last seen, that her family officially reported her missing. The delay in reporting Anna's disappearance to the authorities was due, in part, to the strained relationship between Anna and her family. After Anna married Anthony, she became increasingly isolated from her relatives, particularly her aunt, who had once been her primary caregiver. At the time of her disappearance, her family didn't know where she had been living or what she had been doing. Nevertheless, once the case was reported, investigators began to piece together a series of unsettling events. The fact that Anna was last seen with an unidentified man and that her estranged husband had a history of violent behavior led investigators to suspect foul play. Her family, too, found it difficult to believe that Anna would have voluntarily abandoned her life and her daughter. They strongly suspected that something had happened to Anna and that she had become the victim of crime. Anthony Manning, despite being in jail when Anna disappeared, remained a central figure of suspicion. His history of controlling and violent behavior, coupled with the fact that he had been the subject of a kidnapping charge just months earlier, cast a shadow over his involvement. Although he was never formally charged with Anna's disappearance, his actions before and after her vanishing remain a source of intrigue for those who have followed the case. The unidentified white male who was seen with Anna outside Chin's Jewelry has remained a crucial part of the puzzle. Investigators have been unable to determine his identity, and there have been no credible leads as to who he might have been or what role he played in Anna's disappearance. This man's presence raises many questions, especially since Anna had no reason to be with him if her plans were only to speak with her aunt. Who was he, and why was Anna with him on the day she disappeared? This mysterious individual could hold the key to understanding what happened to Anna Manning. Was he involved in her disappearance, or was he simply a witness? Was he someone with whom Anna was familiar, or a stranger who may have played a more sinister role? The fact that this man has never been identified has left investigators with more questions than answers. Given the facts of Anna Manning's case, it's clear that foul play is suspected. She left behind her young daughter and had no reason to disappear voluntarily. The involvement of her estranged husband, who had previously been convicted of unlawful imprisonment, further suggests that she may have been the victim of a violent crime. Though he was in jail at the time of her disappearance, his history of abusive behavior towards Anna and the strange circumstances of her vanishing cannot be overlooked. Another possibility is that the unidentified man seen with Anna that day played a role in her disappearance. If he was involved, it raises the question of whether Anna knew him or if he was a stranger who lured her into a dangerous situation. Without knowing who he was, the investigation cannot definitively confirm or rule out his involvement. As of today, Anna Manning's case remains unsolved. On December 3, 1974, 22-year-old Edward Nichols was last seen leaving his parents' home in Florence, Kentucky, to go hunting with a friend. The young man, who had been on probation for a drug charge, would never return, and despite extensive efforts to locate him, his fate remains unknown to this day. Nichols' case has become one of the many missing persons cases that authorities believe may involve foul play, though no definitive answers have ever been found. Edward Nichols was last seen at approximately 9 a.m. on that cold December day. He had made plans to go deer hunting with a close friend, 23-year-old David Stites. The two men had a regular hunting routine and had decided to head out for a day in the woods. Their destination was Shady Nook Bottoms, a secluded hunting area located off South Fork Road, about 10 miles west of Union, Kentucky. The area was remote, and once there, Nichols and Stites would go their separate ways in search of deer, agreeing to meet again later at the car. However, when the scheduled time to meet arrived at 3 p.m., Nichols was nowhere to be found. Stites, who had been hunting in a different part of the area, returned to the car, but his friend was missing. He waited for 4 hours before contacting the authorities. Despite his best efforts to locate Nichols, Stites was unable to find him, and the search began that evening. At first, authorities were unsure what to make of Nichols' disappearance. The two men had been hunting in an area known for its rough terrain, and it was not entirely unusual for someone to get disoriented or lost in the woods. However, the longer Nichols remained missing, the more authorities began to suspect that something more sinister had taken place. It was highly unusual for someone to simply vanish while on a hunting trip, especially without any signs of struggle or accident. The investigation soon revealed several unusual aspects of Nichols' disappearance. First, Stites, who had been with Nichols when he vanished, was fined $114 for hunting deer out of season. Nichols himself would have faced up to a $500 fine had he reappeared. This introduced a possibility that Nichols may have had some reason to avoid returning. But as time passed and no word came from him, this theory began to lose credibility. Another important detail was Nichols' probation. At the time of his disappearance, he was on probation for a previous drug charge. His probation was set to end in January 1975, just a month after he went missing. Nichols had a check-in meeting with his probation officer scheduled for the day after he vanished, but he missed the appointment, prompting a warrant to be issued for his arrest. Given the circumstances, authorities initially entertained the theory that Nichols may have simply chosen to disappear, avoiding his legal obligations. This theory, while plausible, is highly unlikely. It's rare for someone to voluntarily disappear, especially without a trace of contact or any attempt to reach out to loved ones. Over the course of the investigation, the authorities began to shift their perspective. They no longer believed that Nichols had willingly chosen to vanish or that he had suffered an accident while hunting. Instead, they suspected that Nichols may have become the victim of a homicide. The lack of any evidence to suggest a hunting accident or any sign of voluntary disappearance pointed to the possibility of foul play. Nichols had not been involved in any dangerous activities that would explain his sudden disappearance, and it seemed more likely that he had been harmed. Despite a thorough search of the area and multiple interviews with friends, family, and acquaintances, no leads emerged. Edward Nichols was a house painter by trade and lived on in Street in Union, Kentucky. He was described as a quiet but hardworking young man who had a history of making mistakes, which led to his probation. Despite the legal issues he was facing, Nichols had a promising future ahead of him, and he had no apparent reason to want to disappear. His family and friends were devastated by his sudden vanishing, and they struggled to understand what had happened to him. Nichols' background also played a significant role in the investigation. While the drug charge on his record might have suggested to some that Nichols was involved in shady activities, there was no evidence to suggest that he had been involved in any criminal activity at the time of his disappearance. The only significant issue in his life at the time was the probation, which he had almost completed. This raised further questions about why he would have chosen to disappear voluntarily. As time passed, multiple theories were suggested regarding what happened to Edward Nichols. One possibility is that Nichols became involved in a violent altercation while in the woods, either with someone he knew or a stranger. Given the secluded nature of Shady Nook Bottoms, it's conceivable that Nichols crossed paths with someone with malicious intent, resulting in his death. It's also possible that Nichols was a victim of a random crime. The area where he disappeared was rural and sparsely populated, and it's not unusual for such places to be the site of crimes that go unnoticed for long periods of time. However, this theory is speculative, and there is no concrete evidence to support it. Finally, some believe that Nichols' disappearance could have been connected to the ongoing drug trade in the area. While there was no evidence that Nichols was directly involved in any illegal activities at the time, his prior arrest and probation raised the possibility that he may have crossed paths with the wrong people. However, this theory has remained unsubstantiated. As the years passed without any progress in the case, the hope of solving the mystery of Nichols' disappearance began to fade. Despite multiple investigations, new theories, and a few promising leads, there have been no breakthroughs in the case. Nichols' family continues to hope for answers, but the likelihood of finding out what happened to him diminishes with each passing year. The case of Edward Nichols remains unsolved, with no definitive answers as to what happened to him on that cold December day in 1974. The lack of evidence and the passage of time have made it difficult to pursue any solid leads. On June 18, 1985, 44-year-old Harry Mopin, a businessman in the coal industry, was last seen near his workplace in LaJunior, Kentucky, in Harlan County. He and his business partner owned the Gano Coal Company and Aqua Processing Inc., both of which had operations in the area. Mopin was often in the Harlan area for work and sometimes stayed in an office trailer located on mine property in nearby Shields, Kentucky. However, he lived in Richmond, Kentucky, where his family resided. He vanished without a trace, and despite initial efforts to locate him, Harry Mopin has never been heard from again. Mopin's disappearance initially seemed to be a perplexing mystery, but as time passed, it became clear that foul play was likely involved. Years later, the investigation would take a dramatic turn when authorities focused their attention on a man named Ernest Lee Hensley, a business associate of Mopin's. Despite charges being brought against Hensley in connection with Mopin's death, the case would ultimately hit a dead end, leaving many unanswered questions. Harry Mopin was a well-established businessman in the coal industry, co-owning two companies, Gano Coal Company and Aqua Processing Incorporated, both of which operated in the Harlan County area. He was frequently on business in and around Harlan, sometimes staying in an office trailer on mine property. While he spent a significant amount of time in the area, Mopin made his home in Richmond, Kentucky, with his wife and two young children. On June 18, 1985, Mopin was working near the Gano Coal Company's mine when he disappeared. It was not unusual for him to be away from home for business, but this time, he failed to contact his family or return home, and his absence raised immediate concern. Friends and family became increasingly worried as they learned that Mopin had never been heard from again after the day he was last seen. His family and associates initially thought that something might have happened to him while he was working, but the more time passed without word from Mopin, the more it seemed like something more sinister had occurred. Despite his absence, it would take some time before authorities officially declared him missing. Investigators soon began to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding his disappearance, focusing on Mopin's business dealings, his relationships, and his personal connections, particularly with one individual, Ernest Lee Hensley. Ernest Lee Hensley was a business associate of Harry Mopin's, and the two men had been involved in business dealings together. Hensley was the last person known to have seen Mopin before he vanished. The two men were familiar with each other through their work in the coal industry, and their relationship had become an important focal point in the investigation into Mopin's disappearance. Hensley's involvement in the case initially seemed incidental, but as authorities investigated further, they began to believe that he may have been more than just a witness. In 2010, more than 2 decades after Mopin's disappearance, authorities charged Hensley with murder and evidence tampering in connection with Mopin's death. According to the authorities, they believed that Hensley shot Mopin at a coal mine owned by the Gano Coal Company, then disposed of his body, likely taking it outside of Harlan County. The body was presumed to be unrecoverable, and investigators were unable to locate any physical evidence that could substantiate their theories. Hensley was arrested, and the case against him appeared to be building. Investigators noted that the timing and circumstances surrounding Mopin's disappearance pointed to foul play, and they believed that Hensley had something to do with the coal business dealings gone wrong. The authorities speculated that Mopin had been killed because of business-related issues, though the exact motive for his murder remained unclear. However, despite the arrest and charges, the case against Hensley would not be as straightforward as authorities had hoped. In March 2013, nearly 3 years after the charges were filed, the case against Ernest Lee Hensley was dismissed due to a lack of evidence. The prosecution cited that crucial witnesses who might have supported the case against Hensley were unavailable to testify. Without their testimony, the evidence against Hensley was insufficient to proceed with the charges, and the case was dismissed without prejudice. This meant that the charges could potentially be refiled if new evidence surfaced in the future. The dismissal of charges was a blow to those seeking justice for Harry Mopin, especially to his family, who had spent years hoping that the truth about his disappearance would eventually come to light. Despite the lack of a conviction or a clear resolution, the belief that Mopin met with foul play remained strong. His family and many others continued to believe that Ernest Lee Hensley was responsible for his death, and the dismissal of the case only added to the frustration and confusion surrounding his disappearance. Since the charges against Hensley were dropped, there have been no major developments in the case. Mopin's disappearance remains unsolved, and his family continues to struggle with the absence of closure. While some believe that Hensley may have been involved, others wonder whether there is more to the story, whether Mopin's disappearance was the result of a business dispute, a personal vendetta, or something else entirely. Several theories have emerged regarding the circumstances of Harry Mopin's disappearance. The most widely believed theory is that Mopin was murdered by Ernest Lee Hensley, who may have been motivated by a business dispute or some personal issue between the two men. Given the nature of the coal industry and the significant stakes involved in their dealings, it is possible that Mopin's disappearance was tied to business conflicts that escalated to violence. Another theory suggests that Mopin's death might have been the result of a larger network of criminal activity within the coal industry. Hensley may not have acted alone, and the circumstances surrounding Mopin's death could involve others who had a vested interest in keeping the incident quiet. However, without concrete evidence or witnesses to support this theory, it remains speculative. Mopin's family has consistently expressed their belief that he met with foul play and that justice has not yet been served. The fact that his body was never recovered, combined with the years of legal battles and the dismissed charges against Hensley, has left the case in limbo. His disappearance remains one of the many unsolved mysteries in the history of Harlan County. Harry Mopin's case is one of the many missing persons cases that has haunted the region for decades. His sudden and unexplained disappearance in 1985, followed by the legal battle involving Ernest Lee Hensley. While foul play is strongly suspected, the exact circumstances surrounding Mopin's death remain unclear. The case against Hensley was dismissed. As of today, Mopin's case remains unsolved.